In 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. And welcome everyone to this episode of the Real Leaders Podcast. Welcome everyone to this episode of the Real Leaders Podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Edwards. Joining us today is the CEO of My GreenLab. Please welcome Mr. James Connelly. James, thanks for being with us today.
Oh, thanks for the opportunity, Kevin. I'm looking forward to it.
I'm excited. So I saw the name My GreenLab. Are you a scientist? You wear a lab coat? Tell us more about My GreenLab.
Well, that's a great question. Well, I'm actually not a scientist, and in fact, I'm an architect by training, and I worked in sustainability in the building industry, in the green building industry, for a decade. And I actually joined as CEO of My GreenLab a little over a year ago. I was serving as a board member previously. Really to take the organization and grow and scale our impact all over the world. Previously, I worked growing green building programs and green product certifications in the building industry and the building product industry, and was advising the founder of My GreenLab, who is a neuroscientist, who got fed up with the environmental impact of laboratory research, and she decided to step down and pursue other interests, and the board asked me to take on the role. So I'm learning a lot about the scientific industry. It's fascinating. There's just a huge amount of environmental impact as well, and a ton of low-hanging fruit where we can make a difference. And My GreenLab's mission is to create a culture of sustainability and science, and I think we're well on our way of creating a bit of a sea change in the scientific industry where sustainability is core to what these businesses are thinking about.
Interesting. So tell me about that point when you get called up, essentially. Hey, I want you to help grow the company. What was your initial reaction?
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, I think it was certainly a big leap going from green building into sustainability and science and scientific research. I think my experience though growing sustainability programs is a lot of things about sustainability are similar across industries. It's about getting people motivated first, helping them understand the problem, and then providing them pathways and opportunities where they can really make change. I do think my background and knowledge in certifications really helps. My GreenLab fundamentally offers a number of labs, a lab certification, a product certification for lab supplies. So I was knowledgeable about the certification landscape. Moreover, though, I was frankly really excited. As a board member, I started to learn about the environmental impact of research. Labs use 10 times more energy than a typical commercial office space, 4 times as much water. They produce 2% of plastic waste. Well, one research study said that it's actually probably much higher. And the global pharmaceutical industry produces 55% higher carbon emissions than the automotive industry. And a lot of people frankly, I didn't know that. And so the opportunity to help shine a light on an industry where there's a lot of opportunity for change was really exciting.
I had no idea about that. Big pharma, pharmaceutical companies contributing more than automotive companies. It's scary to think about that's the case in this day and age. Now, when business owners and people hear the word sustainability, some people perceive it as this big, scary thing to take away profits. How are you approaching these pharma companies, these laboratories, when you're trying to speak to them about this certification process?
Yeah, well, great question. I'm trying to, I think obviously a business has to be profitable. But I think, for most of the business leaders that I work with previously in the building industry, where I worked with a lot of technology companies, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, the executives understood that figuring out how the company fits into a future zero carbon world is part of what they need to be doing to have a functional business enterprise long term. And I think that they see that in science as well. I think the prevailing attitude, however, in science, and why, frankly, it's been a little bit of a laggard in terms of addressing its own environmental footprint, is that the priority was on the research itself. If you're creating a breakthrough for cancer, you're creating a treatment for COVID, that treatment maybe is more important than the environmental impact. But what we're finding working with research laboratories is there's a way to do things in a smarter, more research efficient way. And that scientists themselves are really personally motivated to reduce the environmental impact of their work. So, our organization, and one of sort of the unique values that we offer and why we've been able to crack the nut of a difficult to address industry in terms of sustainability is we don't ever pretend that the science isn't important or that the science shouldn't have priority. The research should have priority, and we provide pathways and tools that are flexible, that allow researchers to reduce their environmental impact while still conducting the really important world-changing, life-changing work that they're doing.
So the certification is one aspect of what you do, but why did My GreenLab find the certification process to be a great solution? Why did you decide to use it as a way for companies to measure how they're doing, track their progress? What have you found specifically about the certification versus like a B lab that you found to work?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So, a huge proportion of the overall impact for a university or a pharmaceutical company is their research labs. So at a major university like Harvard or MIT, something like 50 to 60% of their carbon emissions actually come from their research labs. And so they're difficult to address types of spaces because they're doing very specialized work. There's safety protocols that are kind of required and baked in. And the way to actually get at change is to engage the scientists themselves in behavior change. And there's a huge amount of low-hanging fruit. Things as simple as turning the lights and the equipment off as when you leave, closing the fume hood sash, to making changes in how you're designing treatments and bringing them to market that fundamentally reduce the environmental impact of creating that treatment that people can implement. But the reason our GreenLab certification works so well is it actually engages the scientists themselves. It helps them understand the environmental impact that they're having individually as well as the organization overall. And then it provides them best practices and ways that they can drive reductions in their work.
What have been some of the challenges these scientists have come across when it comes to decreasing their carbon emissions or anything that has to do with a healthier work environment?
Yeah, well, I think, some of the challenges, the one we always hear is, it's highly regulated space. There's nothing we can do. And it's kind of interesting because we find almost invariably when we go in and we do a certification for a project, there are things that you can do even in a highly regulated environment, highly controlled environment that you can do to reduce environmental impact. One of the big challenges that researchers also have is they're kind of constrained by the instrumentation and the products that they can buy. There's tons of single-use plastics. There's these big pieces of equipment. The two largest energy consuming being ultra-low temperature freezers, which are necessary for storing the vaccine, for example, autoclaves, which is designed to manage and sterilize waste. So we actually launched a new certification program for laboratory products and supplies called the ACT label that allows consumers and scientists to buy products that are made in a more sustainable way or that are more efficient, so they're not constrained, or they can actually drive changes within the supply chain of the products that they're buying as well.
Very interesting. Okay, so now we know a little bit more about My GreenLab. The audience is coming up to speed about the impact of pharma on carbon emissions. Your company helping these scientists out and understanding their role in this reduction, how they can use these safe practices. I'm really focused on your transition, actually. What was the state of My GreenLab when you took it over, and what were some of the things you've learned from a leadership perspective to how to galvanize a culture, especially when a new leader takes the reins?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. First of all, I want to give a shout out, just an incredible credit to the founder of My GreenLab, Allison Paradise, who took this concept and brought it to market and demonstrated that green labs were possible, and built a community of professionals.
Incredible.
This organization, completely from the ground up. And so I really had the fortune and an incredible opportunity. So Allison Paradise, the founder, when she invited me to join the board, she knew the organization was at a period of transition. The board and I were working with her to set up the organization to scale, because while we were touching some labs, hundreds of labs, there's millions of labs in the world. And if we're really going to meet climate change targets, and we're really going to make a dent in this massive energy consuming, resource consuming industry, we knew the organization had to scale. So she put in place just incredible bones in terms of the programs. So I had the opportunity to kind of take those programs and then really think about how they can scale. Starting and getting something going from the beginning sometimes is a bit of a different task than scaling it. And scaling it, a lot of the focus is on the operational systems, the HR systems, the people systems, the technology systems, the website infrastructure, and the marketing infrastructure. And then building, and nonprofits actually, unfortunately, don't generally do a very good job of this. Businesses are more familiar with this concept, but you have to build a sustainable revenue source that allows you to continue to have the funding to add additional people to scale your impact. And so putting in place a sustainable revenue model through grants and sponsorships, and how our programs are priced so that we continue to add exceptional people, and drive and scale our impact was one of the things that I really focused on first and foremost. And I think that's a little bit of a challenge for any organization.
Oh, yeah.
People get into nonprofits because they want to do the work because it matters. They don't generally get into them because they want to be thinking about how to build a scalable business model necessarily. And so, making sure that everybody understood the importance and value of that, and how a sustainable financial model is going to drive greater impact for the organization long term and better achieve the mission, was kind of the biggest hurdle we had to get over as an organization. And I think we're really coming out on a positive end of that. We've added significant new team members. We went from a team of 3.5 to a team of close to 10. And we have a team retreat actually coming up here in Seattle, where we're going to cement our organizational values and really hopefully coalesce around a new vision for the organization moving forward to dramatically make a difference in this industry that we think is so important to do so for the world and for the climate and for the science industry itself.
And James, it's a story I keep hearing time and time again, and it's just an inspiring one from social entrepreneurs, from you and Allison, starting with this intention. Hey, if we're going to actually take on this problem that not that many people, including someone who interviews social entrepreneurs on a daily basis, knows about the pharmaceutical waste, let's start with that intention. Let's solve that. Let's build a model, a scalable model. And as we grow and grow and grow, we solve that problem even more. And I'm curious, though, from a leadership perspective, when you have these retreats, and you're trying to, let's say you start with your values, you're trying to clarify your focus, what do you prioritize? Are you prioritizing your operations? Are you prioritizing your people with HR, your marketing? If it's a 3-legged stool, which one holds the most weight to you?
Yeah, I mean, well, I think that they're all important, and I think the CEO's role as, the ultimate leader of the organization is to be able to see all parts of the business and how they work together and how they work together in harmony. I would add another one to that that's relevant to organizations like ours, which is the technical quality of our programs. The outcomes of going through our certification process, the integrity of that process, that is incredibly important to us as well. So, it's about balancing all those concerns together, and then getting your people systems, your operational, financial systems, technology systems, your programs, the actual work that you're doing, and your marketing engine that's driving new interest, which is so important to a social venture, because you can have the best programs in the world, but unless you're getting out the word to the whole industry, you're not going to have the impact that you could have. You need to get those all working together through a common purpose. And one of the first things we did as an organization when I started is the board and I, as well as our stakeholder community, as well as the team, developed a new 3-year strategic plan that set out clear, measurable goals for what we're trying to achieve. We put them down on paper. We got everybody to provide input on them, and we shared it as broadly as we could with the world, so that people knew what our intentions were and what we're trying to accomplish. And I think putting together that strategic plan and getting alignment between both our team and our board and our stakeholder community was really fundamental. And I think that's been a big part of what's driving what we're seeing now, which is really exponential growth of our programs.
And James, I know you're a basketball guy. We talked about this a little bit before the show. We're both Hoop Fest players up in shout out Spokane, Washington. As a basketball coach, you got to know your players. You got the point guard who's handles the ball every single time down the court. They got to shoot, they got to drive, they got to dish it out when the time is right. You have the glue guys, the people that might be more defensive, vocal captains of the team. You got your forwards, you got your wings. Everyone kind of plays a role, and it's up to that coach, that CEO, that leader to put people in the right seats. How bullish are you on making sure people get in the right seats, prioritize what they're doing? And do you have some type of philosophy on how you like to position the employees in your company?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think the metaphor's really apt. I think maybe one way to continue that metaphor is I think that a lot of founders of organizations and a lot of CEOs, not necessarily founders of organizations that kind of get to the 5, 10, 20, 30 person size, the CEO is still the star player, and they're still the one, shooting the threes, the highest score. And I think that my approach to leadership, and this is something that I've been learning a lot organizationally, is that you need to be intentionally trying to step back from that leading player role to the coaching role, which is putting people in the right place and being really intentional about it. And I think that's a hard thing for a lot of people to do. I've struggled with it in my career. I think probably every leader struggles with it. Sort of the idea, well, I got to be out there. I got to be the one taking the shot. And instead understanding where you can find people to step into roles that you are taking that might even be much better than you in a more specialized way, and likely are much better. That's why you're hiring them. You always want to hire people that have skills that you don't necessarily bring to the table. So I think that, what we're doing organizationally is we're actually mapping out, me with our chief operating officer, Sam Wright, spent some time earlier, which we're going to be talking about at our team retreat, mapping out where the organization is going to be in 3 years and what are the key roles and who do we want in those positions, and do we grow people internally into those roles or do we look outside? But I think having clarity about where the organization is moving and then filling those roles intentionally to fulfill that long-term strategic vision that you have of the organization is really important. Sometimes I think people can be super reactive with hiring. They're like, oh, we're really busy with this task. Let's hire somebody to do that, rather than thinking about how that fits in the bigger picture and the evolution of the organization overall. And then that allows you to think about recruiting in a longer term perspective too. If for us, eventually we're a nonprofit organization, we're going to be adding a director of philanthropy, somebody to lead our fundraising efforts long term. We have we don't have the funding to hire that person yet, but we will soon. And we can kind of map that out So I think it's just being really, really intentional about your organization structure, understanding what those roles are, communicating that clearly, and then making sure everybody has a good understanding of their job role and how that job role overall contributes to the long-term strategic outcomes of the organization. But I
Great
think
advice.
I have a philosophy that I'm trying to implement, which is, figuring out ways that I can step back as a leader and focus on the longer term strategic issues like hiring, rather than being on the court, if you will. But we're still small. We're still only 10 people, so sometimes I still get out on the court, which is fun too.
I think that's a great example, because I think good leaders delegate authority, not tasks. So by taking that next step, that next level, you're empowering others versus just telling them what to do. And I think it's a big difference between a leader and a manager. And wish the best of luck for your organization. Seems like you also have a game plan going. You're creating the alignment, clear focus, clarity. You mentioned a few times. What does scale mean to you?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's actually something that again we're going to be talking about at our team retreat upcoming. The way that a lot of businesses think about scale, right, is like, we want to grow by X% a year. And I think that more and more I'm thinking that the way we want to think about scale is rather what is the overall size of the industry, what is the environmental impact, and how much do we think we can change it, and how much do we need to change it if we're going to meet Paris Climate Agreement targets. So scale for us isn't number of people or amount of revenue, or maybe even the number of labs, although those are really important impact metrics for us. But how are we actually measuring and changing the industry overall, and how are we doing so quickly enough to make sure that we avoid the worst impacts of climate change? That's the scale that we need to achieve, I think, to truly achieve our mission.
Measuring impact seems to be very difficult for a lot of organizations. Do you guys find it necessary to measure the impact? How would you measure the impact? And what's your philosophy, I guess, on this, quote unquote, if you believe in it, the triple bottom line: people, planet, and profits?
Yeah, well, I think for nonprofits, I think you should be applying the same discipline that a for-profit company does to measuring your impact in a nonprofit organization. And so we're very focused. We're a very data-driven organization. We measure everybody engaged with our programs. We use Salesforce, our CRM, to evaluate our impact, to understand our customer engagement. And then, as I mentioned, one of the other things we're doing is we're doing an overall carbon impact of the life science industry study. And so the study that I referenced said that 55% of biotech and pharma has 55% higher carbon emissions than automotive, higher intensity.
Right.
We scaled that up to the entire biotech industry, and it turns out that's consistent. The entire biotech industry is 55% higher carbon emissions than the entire automotive industry in terms of intensity, carbon used per unit of revenue. So yeah, I think that for us, we need to find ways that we're measuring impact to ensuring either companies or the industry overall can reduce their carbon impact to levels that will meet the Paris Climate Agreement. I mean, this is what we all as a global community have to be focused on. How do we get to zero carbon early enough that we avoid the worst impacts of climate change? So, that's an overarching mission and purpose for me. The biotech and pharmaceutical industry is a huge part of the footprint. And I think they're really excited and interested in changing. Trying to think in your question on triple bottom line, what we're finding is there is just a myriad of benefits to organizations to be pursuing sustainability. Save energy, save water, create a healthier workspace for the people that are working for you, align with your investors' demands. And younger people want to work at companies that prioritize sustainability. So if you want to be in biotech and pharma or a top university, you want the top students, you want the top researchers. Sustainability has to be core to your mission. So I think there's just such a clarity now in the industry that this is the right way to go. But people just need to know how to do it. They need to have the frameworks and tools, and that's what we provide.
That's spot on. Sustainability has to be core to your mission. What about the organizations where it's not really core, where they don't really, they'll implement, let's say, energy savings. They'll go to solar, and they'll go to renewables. They'll save energy, it'll be efficient, and they'll reduce their carbon emissions. But it's not really core to who they are. It's a great thing to say, to market to people, to bring in others people. But are you finding that if companies don't go all in on sustainability, that it's much more difficult in the long run to continue to incorporate that into their values, into their people, into their products, into their services?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's kind of interesting. There's actually a lot of research to show that there's long-term business value, both in profitability and share price, to companies that truly embrace sustainability. And if you look at some of the best performing companies around, sustainability is now a core part of their mission. And maybe that those companies, however, just when they do something, they do it right, including sustainability. And that's just part of the ethos of the organization. However, I would take a little bit more of a pragmatic approach. Some of these companies that we work with, and I've worked with in the past, they are big behemoths. It's changing the direction of an aircraft carrier. And sometimes for us, like a GreenLab program, we'll start with just one interested scientist, and that interested scientist will get their lab interested, and they'll do a GreenLab certification. That'll get recognized by the leadership of that organization or by the CSR team. And then 3 years later, they have a huge program that's having a massive impact. So sometimes you just got to start where there's interest and build from there. And, in a way that could be a little bit of greenwashing. I have a friend, the former sustainability director, started their sustainability program at Alaska Airlines, that like to refer to these as random acts of greenness. And I think you can get stuck in that trap, like creating a couple green teams, slapping some solar panels on, may feel good, but it needs to be a bigger strategic conversation for the organization to really realize the benefits. But sometimes it takes a few small actions to get people excited and interested. And we've seen that happen. And the mission of My GreenLab is to create a global culture of sustainability and science. So a big part of our work is engaging individuals and getting the whole company to have a culture of sustainability. So it's integrated into their core values as an organization. It's part of their strategic plan, and it's part of the culture of how they operate. And that's when you get the most benefits from sustainability, in my opinion, and that's what I've seen.
And let's talk about that a little bit more. I mean, for people listening to this, that is such a difficult task, to change the culture of an organization, whether it's small or big. Like you mentioned, these aircraft carriers. Here's another analogy. You think about with these big behemoths, they're like battleships. And if you're going to change the culture, it's going to take a long time for them to make that turn. But if they make that turn, it's a much greater force versus a jet ski. A smaller organization, they can do a quick little pivot, make the turn, and be on that route to sustainability a little bit faster. What have been some of the best practices that you've seen, big behemoths such as these battleships, that can make these changes?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I used to work at the International Living Future Institute, which has an amazing set of programs to drive change in the building industry, as well as manufacturing industry for building products. And we used to use a metaphor, and I'm a sailor as well, of a trim tab. And a trim tab is something that goes on the very back of your rudder, and it's just a tiny little flap. Tiny little flap, and when it turns, it creates a swirl of water with through the Bernoulli principle, pulls the entire rudder around. So a giant container ship essentially can be shifted by a hand crank, very, very little amount of effort. And so what we tried to do at ILFI is find kind of those strategic intervention points in the industry where a little push could have a dramatic impact on the industry overall. For example, I started a program called Declare with a number of others. And in fact, our chief operating officer, Sam Wright, who works with me now at My GreenLab, helped start this program with me at ILFI, where we asked the building industry to disclose the ingredients of their building products. And that seems like it's like straightforward, normal thing to do, but no company was doing it at all. But we got one or two companies that were brave enough to be honest about what's in their products, disclose it to the industry, and all of a sudden it became the expectation. Within 5 years, pretty much every company knew it was going to have to disclose the ingredients in its product if it was going to be taken credibly by the industry. So you got to find kind of those key leverage points. And we think those key leverage points in biotech and pharma at My GreenLab are the labs themselves. If we can get the researchers and scientists interested in sustainability, provide actionable pathways where they can make change, celebrate those that are doing so, so that their peers look to them, then all of a sudden, all these companies are competitive, and you can take advantage of a virtuous cycle here where if AstraZeneca talks about its major program where it's doing green labs all around the world, its peers are going to be looking at it. And they're going to follow in their footsteps. And labs are such an incredible space too, because then we can get at the products that are being purchased in a lab. And there's a huge environmental impact for the products that are purchased. So if we can get the lab interested in sustainability, they can buy more sustainable products. And then if we can get a culture of sustainability integrated fundamentally into the organization, as these companies are designing new treatments, as they're developing new things to bring to the market, sustainability can be baked in at the outset. So for us, that's our trim tab. That's our key leverage point where we think we can really shift these companies in a positive direction.
If there's one thing people have learned from this these past 2 years, is they want to know where these things are coming from, how they're made, what is the transparency of these labs, which I find so interesting. And I think, stay on that metaphor of these ships. I live out here in San Diego, and my brother lives up in Newport. And if you look out in the ocean, there's about 30 big cargo ships staying there. People are starting to figure out where their supplies are coming from, where their packages are coming from, where they're made, how they're made. How do you see an increasing role in transparency in terms of consumer knowledge? Do you think conscious consumers and consumer knowledge are going to help shift the change of cultures in organizations, help shift the change of transparency for how products, services, buildings are made, all of the above?
Absolutely. Yeah, and I keep returning to the retreat because I feel like a lot of these themes are things that we're planning to focus on. But transparency is something that's kind of core to our work. Here at My GreenLab, we have our label for laboratory products. It's the first, the premier eco label for laboratory products called ACT, which stands for Accountability, Consistency, and Transparency. And you have to shine a light on the problem to know how to solve it. And you have to be able to put information in the hands of consumers. So I mentioned to you the Declare label in building products. Transparency works in a powerful way. It not only helps consumers then be like, hey, I don't want a product with X toxic chemical in my home. It's funny, a company, when they start putting together their label and they're like, ooh, that one doesn't sound great. A lot of these companies didn't even know what was in their own products that they were selling until they really dug into their supply chain. So transparency allows everybody to make better decisions, both internal to the company as well as to consumers buying more sustainable products. So I think transparency is just fundamental for transformation of the industry overall, because it allows people to make better decisions, and then it allows the market, the positive aspects of the market to take hold in a virtuous cycle.
So James, how far out do you think we are from a personalized consumer product world where consumers are looking at the label. Almost every consumer is looking at the label, understanding where it's coming from, and understanding its impact both on the environment while also on its energy use and also let's say internally in the company.
Yeah, well, I think pretty quickly the carbon impact of products is going to be pretty apparent. Like, I believe Unilever made a statement that they're going to have a carbon label for all of their products, so you can begin to compare products and understand the carbon impact. However, I think it's asking a little bit too much of consumers to say that then they have to spend hours researching and understanding that this is the more sustainable solution. The responsibility really should be with the manufacturer that's publishing this data, and when they're publishing it, understanding how they relate to their peers and how they could be doing better, so they can be offering better options to consumers. So I think it's coming quickly in terms of carbon understanding of carbon impact of products in a number of different industries, from laboratory products to building products to consumer products. But I think that the benefit of transparency is not just so a consumer can make better decisions. It's really that internal positive feedback loop that creates and continuous improvement for the company, that they know they want to do better. They're benchmarking against their peers, and they want to improve.
So let's talk about zero carbon. Let's talk about trends. What trends do you see, or what do you think are coming in terms of how businesses will need to react, or will force businesses to take account of their carbon emissions? Is there a carbon tax coming? Are there carbon dividends coming? How do you see it?
Yeah, well, would love to see that in the U.S. I think that in the absence of a lot of policy and legislative leadership on this issue in the U.S., companies are just moving forward and organizations are moving forward on their own. In the building industry, most of the big organizations we used to work with had zero carbon targets by 2030 or sooner. The biotech and pharmaceutical industry is 100% waking up to this, and in fact, pretty much all of the major players now have either a science-based reduction target or a zero carbon target, and the targets are getting better. One of the reasons I think it took them a little bit longer in this industry is they're really, really particular about setting targets, and I think companies really do work diligently to achieve them. I think there was a lot of zero carbon targets thrown out before people really had much idea how to do them in other industries, and they're playing catch up. So I think that voluntary drive, particularly the UN Race to Zero and the upcoming conference, the Conference of Parties COP26 in Glasgow, is going to really show, any significant company. I mean, the impact of climate change now is so apparent to all of us. We see it in the news every day. The most recent IPCC report said that we have a code red for humanity. And I think any responsible company is going to have a zero carbon target that they're serious about quickly, and they're going to be working to achieve it. And I think that will actually outpace even regulatory requirements. Not to say that regulatory requirements aren't important, because we then need to bring, the stick behind. We have to have the carrot and the stick to make sure people that the laggards actually follow up and meet these requirements. But I'm just seeing a lot of energy and excitement. Companies are setting aggressive targets. There's new innovations, technologies coming online, and I think they're really going to work hard to achieve them. I like to joke with my friends sometimes. It seems like humans are we're really good at working under a deadline, and the deadline's here. And I think people recognize that, and we need to get out of our seats and make something happen right away. And I'm seeing that with pretty much every company I work with, big and small, across multiple industries.
It's interesting, and there's two things I got out of that. One is I've been finding, I'm sure you have as well, is like when you can create comparables, it's much easier for the consumer to make a decision. So if you are working for an environment that's renewable energy, or you're going to invest in a property that has renewable energy versus one that doesn't, they're the same building, and one's going to be cheaper for energy and one's not, you're going to go with the cheaper renewable energy 10 out of 10 times. The other thing I'm thinking about is, you said it's code red, it's here. And I don't know where I stand on this, because I just, like, can humans do it? And I have a very optimistic belief, and I think we do. I think we have the people to turn it around. But dealing with nature is incredibly difficult. And you look at the hurricanes that have happened, and I've got a story real quick, if you will, James. This is actually comes from last night. I knew a guy that came after Hurricane Katrina, and he was on the relief efforts. And the EPA, you talk about regulations. The EPA had oil tankers that had to go store their oil when a flood warning happened into a larger container. Why? They didn't want the tankers going back out into the ocean, damaging the environment. The problem is you have to have electricity to take that oil out, or the gasoline, the oil out. So therefore, transportation was much more difficult. The choppers that had life relief had to go much further into Mississippi, because the oil tanker that had all the oil that was stored needed electricity to release it out. So we are learning from these mistakes, and innovation will happen that way as well. Do you think that if we were to, as a society, especially in America, China, India, actually go to zero carbon, do you think there would be a difference in storms like these?
Well, I mean, if you look at the research in the most recent IPCC report, a lot of the climate change impacts that we have are baked in. And so we're not going to reverse the impacts of global climate change on a short time horizons, maybe not in our lifetimes, frankly, but we will long term, I believe. But our opportunity now is to avoid the worst impacts. And if we think that the hurricanes and the fires occurring and the flooding in Europe and China are bad now, there's a certain tipping point where there's a cascading series of vicious cycle of climate change that just gets worse and worse. So we really have a moment here to redirect the course of human history, and we've risen to big occasions before as a society. We cracked the atom. We we figured out how to transplant hearts. We sent a man to the moon. We'll maybe send one to Mars. So we can rise to big occasions. This is the most important occasion of our generation for our society, and it's absolutely time to step it up. And we have the potential. We have billions and trillions of dollars in investment capital going into new clean technologies. Everybody's awake and they're aware. They're working towards it. The next generation of individuals, climate change is core to their values. So I think we'll tackle it, but we're unfortunately going to be in for a little bit of a rough ride, because things are probably going to get worse before they get better. Long term, I am really excited about new technologies, carbon sequestering technologies. Excited about companies like Interface that are coming up with carpet tiles that are actually made that are carbon negative. They're actually sequestering. I think they call it carbon positive, but they're sequestering carbon each time you buy a product. So we got to get to zero, and then frankly, we need to get beyond. We need to get beyond zero and get so that we're actually pulling carbon out of the sky as quickly as possible to deal with these issues. But unfortunately, there's a little bit of a baked-in issue that we're going to have to deal with, our generation, to make sure the next generation has a world that they can live in.
Definitely, that's a great answer. And I think maybe a better question is, will we do it? And we have the people like you, your company, other organizations, social entrepreneurs, they're thinking past just today. But then I guess the distinction I was trying to make was people solving and reacting to the problems that's actually happening today, such as hurricane relief. And how many more times are we going to have to experience something like this until we go, okay, let's make sure we can try to do everything we can to prevent something like this from happening again. And that's just why do you think that's so difficult for people to grasp? Is it short-sightedness? Is it short-term thinking? What do you think it is?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, people are motivated by the things that impact them. And so, we have a hard time understanding the long-term impacts. It's kind of funny though, the way, like, one of the reasons I've really been enjoying working in the biotech and pharmaceutical industry is these companies understand doing things that are very capital intensive, that take a very long period of time to yield results. And, the business community, I think, also Although, there can be a lot of short-sightedness and quarterly reporting concerns and things like that. The investment community, at least, is really starting to understand, that they need to be encouraging companies to take a long-term viewpoint. And I think that, we all were educated in a way, and the next generation is educated in an even better way about climate change and environmental impact and why it's important. So they're going to come into the world with a much more long-term viewpoint than the previous generation or our generation had, and I think that's really positive. It's kind of a tricky one. You're talking about climate adaptation too. We used to joke around, me and my sustainability nerdy friends, and call climate adaptation like giving up. Oh, shoot, I guess we'll just have to adapt. But it's not really that, because the reality is a lot of this is baked in. So we do have to adapt. We have to become more resilient, while at the same time we're driving towards net zero. And I absolutely do think we can do it. And, I'm going to be part of the net zero conference, the 8th annual. It's been growing exponentially. Just the concept of net zero. When I started at the Living Building Challenge, the idea of net zero buildings was like wild, crazy idea. Now it's mainstream. Net zero is a mainstream concept. And personally, I have some challenges with how the people use it, and they need to be more rigorous with the definition of it. But I think we are going to achieve it. It's coming on the common lexicon. It's part of every corporate strategy now. The UN Race to Zero is pulling in huge amounts of our global economy into this effort. So I definitely think we can do it. To answer your question, I think we will do it, and we have to. We really don't have any other choice.
James, I think it's going to take a great deal of leadership. So let's bring this home, James Connelly. What is your definition of a real leader?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the metaphor that we were talking about before, I think is really apt for me. And it's something that I've matured as a leader, that I am working to embody more and more. You don't need to be the scorer, the one doing every single keynote, the one making every deal, convincing every person. What you really need to be as a leader is within an organization, facilitating that organization to be successful, supporting and bringing in the right players. And then, the work that we do, systemic change in an industry, your organization also needs to be supporting the movement. And it's not about you as an individual leader. It's not even about your organization. It's about the change and impact that you're able to have in the role, and how you support and enable the industry and the community to change. So, I think a real leader needs to understand how to be humble and take the back seat. And that's something that I'm learning more and more, and how we facilitate, how I facilitate individuals within my organization to be successful, and then how we as an organization facilitate the organizations and partners and community that we work with to go out and create the change. That's how we're truly going to be successful long term. So I think it's certainly being the coach rather than the star player. That's what a true leader that has lasting impact. And if you look at the literature of companies that have created massive change and impact long term, and social movements as well, those are the type of leaders that you see.
For James Connelly, I'm Kevin Edwards, asking you to go out there, be the coach instead of the player, support the movement, and always, folks, keep it real. Thanks, James.
Thank you.